Well, hi, Cristina. It's lovely to see you again. I know it's been very challenging period of time in Cuba, and particularly over the last few weeks. As a Cuban living on the island yourself, what is your personal experience of the blockade, and how has it intensified for you over the recent period?
That's kind of a hard question. I was born under the blockade, as most of the Cuban population. So it's kind of a reality in which we just live in, and sometimes it's hard to actually relate how our lives are impacted by the sanctions. But in so many ways, because the U.S. economy is probably the most powerful economy in the world. They believe they own, for example, the currency, the U.S. dollars. They manage, or they have some sort of hegemony over every international economic creditors and all of that. Banks, everyone is afraid of the United States, basically. There are very few institutions, banks, enterprises, companies that are able to bypass sanctions that say directly you can't deal with Cuba in any way. That comes from buying a piece of equipment that has over 10% of US made or US owned parts. That goes with buying cell phones, that goes with dealing with practically any bank in the world. So if you as a country are going to buy something, import food, for example, and Cuba does import a lot of food, then you have to do it. You have to bypass the sanctions. So every bank finds Cuba because it's a risky country. It's considered a risky country. So like in Cuba, you don't have, it's hard to get a car. It's hard to get equipment for agriculture. It's hard to get equipment to do journalism. So it's basically every part of our lives are impacted, because the economy, when you say all these big words, it's the lives of people.
How is it for you on a personal level, for you and your family? I know you have a young baby, for example. How does it impact on you?
Well, to speak more directly in terms of the recent enforcement, because the sanctions were like the most comprehensive and biggest system of sanctions any country has ever endured. But then Trump came along and imposed 243 measures. So personally, first of all, if we're going to buy food for my baby, for example, it's tremendously hard to get any food that is not Cuban made. And the industry in Cuba is tremendously impacted by the sanctions. So you can't get equipment, and it's hard. For example, traveling is practically impossible. To get a US visa, a lot of people used to go to the US, import things personally, and then come here and sell it, or just use it for their families, as I did myself several times. And now it's practically impossible because the consular services are closed. Like, for example, to use a bunch of apps on my phone is practically impossible. I used to use, for example, WeTransfer for a radio show that I have. I can't use it anymore because of the sanctions. WeTransfer stopped giving services to Cuba. And that happens with all the bunch of apps that are afraid of the US sanctions. More now that we are on this crazy unilateral list of states sponsors of terrorism. It is hard. Basically, anything that you're going to buy, the shortages, the lack of things, material things and food in Cuba is strictly related with the sanctions. So of course my life is constantly affected by how the sanctions are, because it is hard to perform as a normal economy when the biggest economy in the world is trying to block you, like literally all the time. And of course it has an impact on my own life.
Okay, thank you. It must be very, very difficult this period of time, alongside all the other difficulties with COVID and so on. But obviously, we've seen around the world the events on July the 11th, and they were beamed into our homes on a daily basis across news channels here and across the globe. In your opinion, what do you think were the reasons for the protests on July the 11th? And what are the views now in Cuba about the current situation?
Well, on July 11th, there are two big scenarios that, although are related, um, uh, can be explained simply. It's not a simple situation. So it's a fact that Cuba is under a combination of crises. Uh, we did have an economic crisis before the pandemic, the enforcement of Trump's measures, which affect not only tourism, but also affect the family economy, because all the ecosystem of informal jobs, of the driver that used to drive the American visitor around in a lot of cities of the island, the palater, the restaurant that used to host the American visitor, all of that disappeared from one day to the other because Trump decided, it's quite complicated. I won't get into that now, but basically, cruise ships stopped coming to Havana from the US. And uh, that service did bring a lot of Americans, visitors, and a lot of people benefit from jobs related with the cruise ships coming. So, first of all, the Trump enforcement, and that made the economic crisis even worse. Then the pandemic came along, and although Cuba was able to handle the pandemic much better than most of the countries of the world, now the situation is quite serious, is quite complicated, and transmission is out of control. And although we do have, and we're very proud to say that, we do have two vaccines already been administered to the population, the transmission is far faster than the vaccination effect. So the situation in hospitals, the shortage of medicines, a specific crisis around electricity services related with a technical problem, not with oil supplies, and of course the shortage of food, and the fact that everyone is at home. A lot of jobs are stopped, are no longer happening, a lot of people out of school, a lot of disconnection from institutions, all of this, and the pandemic, of course, the fact that you can go out, the fact that you can't do anything, and the fact, and there's a background to this crisis related with uh, several neighborhoods and groups of people who are suffering more the inequalities inherent to the fact that we are a third world country in which inequalities do happen and do exist, and we are an impoverished country. So this is one scenario. There's definitely reasons to be upset, to can't see hope in the future. There are reasons for that. And at the same time, there was a huge campaign organized, obviously organized online from the US using different kinds of reference. First, the hashtag SOS Cuba started with SOS Matanzas, which is one of the provinces hardest hit by the pandemic. It was very masterly used by influencers online, essentially on Twitter and Instagram. And a lot of these campaigns online, let's remind our audience that Cuba is every day more connected to internet, is every day more cheaper to get online. So a lot of people went through that, and there's tons of money being dedicated to what in the US they call programs of regime change, which are basically programs that violate the Cuban sovereignty, and they're using the what we would call people, underprivileged people, impoverished groups. That these people are being used as weapon, are being capitalized to act against the government. So to disconnect them from the revolution, from social programs, from their own society. They're being told to, in different ways, paying money, like I'm not talking about thousands. I'm talking about very little money, promising them some sort of leadership in a future political change in Cuba. And these people were used, and these were, let's say, the sponsors, the pushers for these um, riots on July 11th. So both things are true. So there are reasons to be upset in Cuba. There are reasons to demonstrate in Cuba. It's a reality. But at the same time, what happened so well articulated, suspiciously articulated on July 11th, it's clearly was clearly planned strategically from abroad, and this is all the money that for years the U.S. government has put into these platforms, into a bunch of media who are at service of Washington's interests on the island. And it was, to be honest, July 11th, I saw images and I saw events that I would never, I never thought I was going to see in my country. It was a sad day, and I definitely believe that requires a revision of how the government is communicating with the people in general, and how the economy and decisions internally uh, and mistakes that were made internally need to be addressed, and you can't erase one thing with the other. It was manipulated by the US. We had this war for decades now, but now it's getting to a whole new level. It's getting more violent, and it's giving the impression that it's all internal, that it's only related with internal problems and the failures of the government, and it's far more complicated than that. And it's also very, uh, very, I would say, coward to do this in a context of pandemic. And now we're seeing peaks in the levels of transmission strictly related to demonstrations of July 11th.
Yeah, it's obviously a highly coordinated approach to the measures that have been going on for 60 years, as we know. So in terms of SOS Cuba and some of the people, particularly in Florida, who have been calling for humanitarian corridors, for example, what do you say to people around the world on this idea that somehow the United States needs to intervene and get involved in Cuba? What's your response to that kind of position?
Well, the excuse is the humanitarian intervention. That's clearly an excuse. The U.S. doesn't doesn't care. I mean, the U.S. government doesn't care about the humanitarian situation in Cuba. If what I was saying were in truth, let's go to the facts. Joe Biden, the current president of the United States, could have lifted the limits on remittances. There are around over 1.5 million Cubans in the U.S. Many of them send remittances to Cuba. Trump stopped that, and Joe Biden is doing exactly is upholding Trump's policy on Cuba by leaving everything the same way. He's been saying for months that he's reviewing this policy. He's like looking at the map where Cuba is, or like these basic things. A man that was in the same office when Obama changed the policy on Cuba. So all of this is very politicized, and to me, in my personal opinion, he's watching too closely the Florida reaction to all of this. But obviously, an intervention on Cuba from the U.S. doesn't have a humanitarian interest. We're seeing a lot of people, for example, the crazy mayor of Miami calling for war intervention, for bombs, for violence in Cuba. So I just don't relate to this humanitarian intervention narrative, because all I see from that country is aggression and our ways of limiting the way in which me as an individual and my country can develop normally as any other country of the world. So it's a lie. It's not true that they are caring or they're worried about the humanitarian situation in Cuba. This is a perfect excuse and a scenario as that doctrine of the raw fruit, that finally we're getting ready and the revolution will be toppled, like eventually now in just a few days, and it's happening. And that's not true. As a matter of fact, Cuba is more ready and is more prepared to deal with crisis than with circumstances of peace or negotiation, because for 60 years we've been under crisis and under an economic war. But what all of these people calling for intervention, humanitarian or any sort, all of these people, although some of them might be confused and might be thinking about, well, finally we will have a lot of medicines or a lot of food. I don't know what goes through their mind, but the reality is that this is a way of justifying either a military intervention or justifying the sanctions, justifying more pressure in Cuba uh, because the government is not even able to deal with the current situation. And this is a portrait. This is a landscape that they're trying to show, but it's not the reality. So don't fall for that. That's not true.
Thank you. Well, I mean, you mentioned, how people perceive Cuba, and you yourself came to Britain, I think in 2018 or 2019, and studied journalism for a year over here. So you have a very particular and interesting understanding of the media. And I was quite interested in how you think the Western media or the British media portray Cuba in their reports. And is there anything they do well or particularly they miss when they're discussing Cuba, in your experience about journalism, because that plays such an important part in this current situation?
Oh, indeed, you're right. The media construction of what's going on in Cuba is tremendously important because usually media uh, it has journalists. By the way, for example, BBC journalists are no longer in Cuba. They have like a producer that come back and forth. They're in Mexico, and obviously this impacts the way, for example, BBC covers Cuba, because if you're not here, it's even harder for you to understand what's going on. And then I always say that Western media, when people tell me about the unbiased media, the objective media, the free media, I always tell them that I just challenge that, because I've seen myself that hardly ever a big international outlet of any sort, web or TV or whatever, passes the test on Cuba. Hardly ever. Because usually the perspective on Cuba is misled, is politicized, and it fits with the agenda and the perception they have on Cuba, of those that work in that media, of the power that pays for that media, and not the reality and the complexity of this country. And this is another example. In crisis, you see that more clearly. The perception has been this is a failed state. The situation is out of control. And everything is about the repression to demonstrators. And although it might have been evidence of occasional violence from a police force that is not used to this kind of situation, in general, the violence has come more from these articulated demonstrations that in some parts of the island has become quite violent, including launching stones to a child hospitals in Matanzas. I'm talking about serious violence here, unadmissible violence here. And the perception of media is that the police is being repressive, that the state is calling for violence, and that the situation is absolutely out of control. This is a lie. This is not true. And this fits with Washington agenda and perspective on Cuba. And this is why I always challenge the media version. And also the social media is given a misled perspective on that, because the majority of people who are online actively are people that are against the government, are people that in some sort, there's been an interesting phenomenon here, which is I have a bunch of friends all over the world, and some of them never comment on politics. And suddenly you're seeing people pushed to polarizations, pushed to determine themselves in some point of this like binary, black and white. And I'm seeing like Cuba is being used as a laboratory for the same things that we saw on Brexit in the UK, like one set of facts are truth and the other set of facts are a lie, or like in the US with Trump. So one set of the population believes one thing and the other, and there's one side has its media and the other has its media. So this is the same thing that's happening in Cuba. There's no possibility of being in the middle and saying, okay, we do have a bunch of problems that we need to address internally with Cubans inside Cuba, and at the same time, it's true that these demonstrations were articulated from abroad. So it's hard to see, it's hard not to be pushed to the corners, and this is what they want, and this is the strategy on Cuba. And unfortunately the Cubans outside have been used and manipulated in many ways. But definitely my experience, I myself was in the BBC for a few months as an internship, and in the specific case of the BBC, you have one side of the story in English, kind of trying to respect the ethics of having the two sides, not always respecting that. But at the same time, you have the BBC World Service, the Spanish service, which it looks like a Miami based, which they are. They have a big office in Miami. It looks like a Miami Spanish media, like any other kind of media. And this is unfortunate because it's supposed to be the same BBC, but then you read the content in Spanish from BBC Mundo, and it's quite biased, and it looks a lot like any kind of content that could come from any other outlet from South Florida. So in general, has failed. Obviously, there are exceptions. You have Reuters, you have AFP, they're here. You have AP, they're here. And you might find they might, like, for example, this has to do with the routine of how media works. They might write like 5 news or 5 reports, and probably, I don't know, FT might buy the report that fits more with their agenda. So probably Reuters wrote 5 reports, but actually the one that's getting the platform is the one that fits with the international perspective that this is a failed state. So in general, I would say it has been again an example of how media doesn't work when covering Cuba.
Brilliant answer. Thank you, Cristina. Are you checking?
Yeah, I'm ready. I'm just moving because the baby was outside.
Okay, we're nearly there. I'll wait till you settle.
Okay, no, it's fine. I'm fine. So I just changed the scenery.
Well, it looks nice and can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
It looks nice and sunny in Havana. Well, on that subject, what is it like today in Havana? I mean, on the streets of Havana and the streets of Cuba. I mean, you mentioned people think Cuba's this failed state with all this repression. What's it like on a day-to-day basis right now? Is it calm? Is it peaceful?
It is peaceful and it is calm. People are going back to their daily business. Vaccination programs continue in the rest of the country. In Havana, practically all the population that could be vaccinated is already vaccinated here in the capital city. And there's a lot going on. I do believe the government is reacting to this. President Diaz-Canel was just yesterday at the University of Havana. Yesterday was kind of an important day because it was August 5. It was the 27th anniversary of what we call here the Maleconazo, which was 1994. A lot of people went on the streets for real reasons. There was a lot of blackouts. It was the most severe crisis a country in peace has ever lived after the falling of the Soviet Union, 1994. A lot of it's a situation that a lot of people compare to what's going on now. I would say it was far worse than 1994, and a lot of people went on the streets on the Malecón. I'm very near there, a couple of blocks away, and while people were outside and people were shouting all that, suddenly Fidel Castro appeared, and all of those that were against the government suddenly were starting to say Viva Fidel, and the thing turned around. So it's kind of a historic day in Cuba, and just because of that, in controlled environments, the government and some civil society organizations called for people to go outside and to respecting as long as possible the social distancing and wearing masks, which is a mandate here, to express the situation, to talk. And the Cuban president right now is giving kind of a tour of different sectors of the economy, and he was just there at the University of Havana talking to young people. He's trying to understand better. I don't know, I haven't talked to him, but my intake is that he's trying to understand better what's going on. But in Cuba, people are more worried with getting food, with staying in line in a lot of occasions for hours, trying to get medicines when they can. The level of transmissions are high. So people are just focusing on their daily life and on the real problems that we do have. And I always say the idea that we're people outside on the streets calling for libertad and all those big words, uh, the majority of people in Cuba, when you talk to them, are more worried about salaries, about quality life, and more worried about their about the economic situation of the country, and how their lives and their quality lives are worst because of the pandemic, because of the crisis, because of the inflation that we do have a lot of now in Cuba. So people are more worried in the everyday business, like they might be, I don't know, in London or or anywhere else. Uh, and I don't. Um, Having said that, I'm not diminishing the reasons why there's a lot of upset people in Cuba. But what I'm saying is that when you're more focused on getting food, when you're more focused on not getting COVID, or if you do get it, then getting the medicines and dealing with that situation, that's the priority. And I do believe that that should be the priority. Dealing with COVID, Cuba is living its worst situation now. Yesterday, 93 people died. The day before, 98. And the health system in Cuba is ready, is designed for, it's a strong primary health attention. It's not ready for having these thousands of people admitted in hospital, dealing with this kind of situation. So it's definitely a big challenge. And the government is completely focused on that. And that's why it's so coward, as I told you at the beginning, it's so coward to organize this in this moment. It's like, now that you're weak, I'm going for you.
Well, thank you so much, and it's incredible to see Cuba focusing so hard on the prevention of the development of the disease and trying to get out of this crisis. And just a final question, really, Christine, I know you're busy. A lot of people here have been fundraising. We've raised nearly £100,000 for medical equipment and help for Cuba and the vaccination program. A lot of people are asking how they can help Cuba at this time. And we want, obviously, people to help in the correct way and the right way with generosity and so forth. What would you say is the way for people to help Cuba at this time? And also, is there anything else you wanted to say to people in Britain or across the world at this moment?
Well, I'm going to start by the idea that what I want to say to this audience. I as a journalist, I've been in many parts of the world. I've been covering Cuba in different countries of the world, and I can fairly say that I was so impressed by the level of true and authentic love and solidarity from UK organizations, individuals to Cuba. To me, it was so impressive. And I always say that probably one of the most inspiring Cuban immigrants that I've met in my life, I met in London and I stayed at her house. Probably she's listening to me, is part of the audience. Her name is Miriam Palacios, and she's been such a great leader for years to help Cuba, and also dealing with a lot of prejudice that still exists in this country towards the Cubans who live abroad. So ways to help. First of all, and this is extremely important. Everyone that has come to Cuba or understands the situation becomes an ambassador of the truth of Cuba. Because now when BBC or CNN or Biden or Marco Rubio or in general the right-wing discourse owns the narrative of Cuba, this is a problem, because people have a failed perspective, a wrong perspective on this country. So first of all, you are all ambassadors of the reality of my country, and why it's so important to focus on what's important, to leave the sanctions and leave this country be, and let it and let it live. This is the first thing. And the second thing, of course, now, like if you come individually, and I don't think it's possible from the UK, but if you come, medicines, food, and hygiene products are free of taxes from custom duties. Um, the government has made public accounts where you can send money to, and of course, I guess the CSC Cuban Solidarity Campaign, which has worked so intensely and has such a great relation with the Cuban embassy, probably knows ways of sending medical equipment, which go from syringes, but also I will go further than that. Think about the many women in the health sector that might need period products. Most of the workers in the health sector are women. I'm talking about antibiotics, which we don't have a lot, and we do have the vaccines. The vaccines are getting produced, but we do need the syringes, and anything that can be sent, it will be useful essentially for not only in Havana, or not specifically in Havana, but in other parts of the country in which the economic situation is worst, and in which it's harder to get anything. And again, thank you for inviting me to this. But for me, I think the biggest kind of help that we can receive right now is putting the word of how Cuba really is and what's troubling this country out there, with a sense of responsibility, and with on understanding and challenging the Western media narrative on what are the problems in this country. There were episodes of violence against the UK embassy in London, and we need to stop uh, this attempt of pushing us apart, of divorcing us apart, of polarizing this debate, and which in the end has the purpose of losing the sight of what's the real problem, what's the real enemy here. And the real enemy is a country that has determined as the purpose of a clear and publicly outspoken purpose of just erasing the political system of this country, because it sets an example for the rest of the world, and they just don't want that. And as this country, and this is a perspective that it has been said by many analysts, this country is moving forward, and it's moving forward fast. We are about to expand the private sector, control and taxing the private sector, but giving more jobs and better salaries. This country is definitely moving forward, and this is the moment in which they decide to do this, because they don't want Biden to take the Obama's path, and because they think this is the moment to actually go turn Cuba in what they want to see, what it used to be in the 50s, the backyard of the United States, a country with no sovereignty, a country with which could be absolutely colonized by the multinationals that run the international economy. That's what they want, and we can't let them do that. And the first victim, and I didn't say this, the first victim in a war is truth. And that's why it's so important that you guys keep doing what you do, and keep putting the word of what this country means for the rest of the world out there.
Well, thank you, Cristina. They're brilliant words, and heartfelt words that we all aspire to support, and do our utmost and our best to support you in this struggle today and tomorrow going forward. So thank you so much for spending some time with us to give us a clear perspective from Havana itself. It's great to hear from you. I know you're unable to access us on Zoom, so we are very grateful that you were able to join us today. And a big hug for your
my duty. It's my job, Rob. It's my job. You helped me a lot. All of you guys helped me a lot while I was there, and I think it's just what I'm supposed to do.
Oh, well, thank you so much, and best all our love to you and your family and your baby as well. So we hope to see you one day soon. Our best regards, Cristina. Ciao.
Thank you so much. Bye. Ciao.
Okay.